name is Sarah Dryden-Peterson, and along with Natasha Warwick, we co-direct the Cultures, Institutions, and Society Colloquium. And today we're having a joint session of the Cultures and Institutions Colloquium and the Civic and Moral Education Initiative seminar series. And delighted to bring together this panel. I'm actually going to turn it over to Helen Hayes, because she's going to moderate the panel today. But welcome to everyone.
Thank you. Well, welcome, as Sarah said, welcome to everybody. It seemed a wonderful opportunity to link up with the CIS group and to have a joint panel because, for those who are not aware, the Civic and Moral Education Initiative is a very widespread network of people interested in civic and moral education. And we had a seminar series, which many, of course, people attended. And the topic that we're addressing today is global citizenship education, which is quite a controversial issue when you start looking at it. Particularly we talk about it with people from very different backgrounds. It seems a wonderful opportunity to bring together people who've got fantastic expertise in this area, but to some extent have different perspectives. And we're hoping very much that we'll have a lively discussion interacting with you, as well as a discussion amongst the panel. The way we'll be running it is that each panel member will talk for no more than 5 minutes on what global citizenship education means to them. And then we'll have a discussion amongst the panel members. Hopefully they will have some areas of, if not disagreement, different perspectives. And then we'll open it up in the last 15 minutes or so to you as the participating audience. And I know that many of you will have very interesting different backgrounds of education relating to global citizenship in your own countries, in different disciplines, in different contexts. And so we're hoping for a very lively discussion. The event is being recorded, so if you have any objection to being on camera, make your points clear or just don't say anything. But we'll be happy to participate. Just to introduce the panel, on my left is, I'm sure you know who they are, I'll introduce you. Fernando Rimas is the director of the Global Education Innovation Initiative here, and his work particularly focuses on understanding how to educate children and youth so they can thrive in the 21st century. And he and his colleagues have just finished a comparative study of the goals of education as reflected in the curriculum in Chile, India, Mexico, Singapore, and the United States. And one of the things that is core to this approach is why global citizenship education, aligned with helping students advance human rights and contributing to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, why it's so crucial to the present time. And of course, it is. And Fernando's work is very widely recognized, and he has in fact conceptualized and defined the profile of a global competent citizen in the 21st century. Connie Chung is Associate Director for the Global Education Innovation Institute, and she's currently working with researchers, including of course with Fernando, over many regions of the world, looking at 21st century education, civic education, global citizenship education, and the capacity of organizations and people to work collaboratively towards, as I say, powerful, relevant, rigorous, and meaningful education for all children. Then we have Vido Chopra. Vido is a doctoral student here at the school, and his research examines the impacts of conflict on young people's education, their life, trajectories, and civic issues, and the transnational ties they develop or sever with their communities. He's undertaken research work in Burundi, Ethiopia, India, Rwanda, and Lebanon, and he is passionate about generating action-oriented knowledge that focuses on the strength and agency of individuals impacted by conflict. And finally, Sarah Dryden-Peterson, who I'm sure you all know, her research focuses on the connection between education and community development, specifically the role education plays in building peaceful and participatory societies. Her work is situated in conflict and post-conflict settings and in diaspora communities. She's concerned with the interplay between local experiences of children, families, and teachers in development and implementation of national and international policy. And her long-term research on refugee education has played a critical role in shaping global policy on the importance of quality, forward-looking education in all phases of emergence. So we have people with very different backgrounds and a very strong record of thinking about the issues from a global perspective, meaning from the perspective of many different nations, as well as coming from where they are in this country. In thinking about this panel, I have a number of core ideas, very few, which I'll put to you. I have been thinking critically about this area, and some of the thoughts that came to me when I was doing so, which I hope will generate discussion. What are the problems that global citizenship education addresses? And are there different priorities in different contexts? Who are the targets of global citizenship education? And are 21st century skills the same in all countries and contexts? And these are questions, but there's also some provocative questions as well. Is global citizenship education primarily about avoiding parochial thinking amongst primarily American or other Western students? Or is it a route to true transnational communication? Or, perhaps more cynically, is it really a way for powerful nations to spread their modes of thinking? So having raised these questions, let's start with Fernando. Oh, you're chewing, okay.
I
got to wait.
That's why I'm eating.
Okay, in that case, Connie, why don't you start?
Hi. I know that many of you could also be on this panel, so I speak humbly from a limited, my own perspective. And I guess I would start by just clarifying that I've always been interested in education that would help students not only develop themselves, but also their communities. So I approach this whole question of global citizenship education from that what I think is of a larger civic education, but not only just civic education of knowledge, but actually enabling them to make a better world, so to speak. So I want to be clear and upfront about my values and assumptions in speaking to that. As far as defining what it means to me, that is a I would say in the research that Fernando and I have done in the last 3 years in 21st century education, from having spoken with various different people from different countries at different levels, not only education stakeholders, but businesses. And David Deming at our school has done really good work on the kinds of competencies that students might need in the 21st century. Global citizenship education feels like it's not a nice to have, it's almost a must have because of the changes that are taking place in our world so rapidly and so quickly. The way that migration is happening, and I know Benur and Sarah will talk about this, migration, refugee crisis, the SDGs you can take a look at for the outline of the larger issues. But again, I don't think it's a nice to have, I think it's a must have. I don't know to the question that Helen posed about what it might look like in different contexts. I have students in my class that are doing a research practicum looking at what global citizenship might look like in the rural context in Peru or for a nomadic community in Cameroon, for example. So I'm waiting to hear from them about what they find. I think it's an important question, but again, I think posing that question in those communities is not a nice to have, but again, a must have. What does that look like? It might look different, but I think considering that and making that question one that's important and a priority is something that we feel, or that I feel like is really relevant to the 21st century. As far as kinds of different priorities, again, this perspective of not just knowledge, but actually cultivating skills and attitudes and values and actionable skills. I think one of the things that are missing in a lot of the things that I've been reading about global citizenship education is its attention to tying it to adolescent development or child and youth development. So as children are developing and as they're forming their gender identity, sexual orientation identity, religious identity, ethnic identity, social identity, and do I belong in my country, do I belong in my ethnic community, do I belong to the world, that is happening, I think, again, from a perspective not just as a researcher, but as someone who's taught high school English, that's happening with our adolescents and our young people, and the ways that I'm not seeing is the way that we connect, these skills that we say are important for employment to the actual development of a full human being and the identity formation that naturally takes place, I think, in those years. And so I feel like there's some really needed conversation and research around not just broad sets of skills, but what's actually appropriate and targeted towards student interests and motivation and relevance to what they're thinking. And I can give, I don't have time, but I can give examples. I mean, even if you were to look back at what you're thinking when you were sitting in classes from K through 12, you paid attention, I bet some of you, most of you, to what was happening in your communities and in the world. And so how does their thinking, how does the students thinking about how they're developing and the problems they encounter? And I would argue that unless we give young people the absolute practical knowledge that are involved with changing the world and making a difference and addressing some of those issues that impact them directly and even farther on down the road, then other people will. And that school is an optimal place, schooling is an optimal place where we can actually have that kind of discussion. When you see a problem or an issue, what are some constructive ways to address it and solve those issues, as opposed to others that are not so relevant. So.
Thank you, Colleen. Fernando, you want to have 5 minutes?
Thank you. So I think of global citizenship education as a subfield of citizenship education. And I think of it as distinct from global education, a cosmopolitan education, or an education aligned with global standards. So let me explain. I think for global citizenship education, the goal is to help students develop curiosity, appreciation, and understanding of the relationships between affairs that are local and global, and their place in those relationships, current and past, and help students develop a cosmopolitan mindset and a disposition to act on issues of global significance. The disposition to act is important because it's what distinguishes, in my mind, global citizenship education from just global education. So let me explain now those differences. I think global education is an education that cultivates an understanding of global affairs and includes global influences in the curriculum. And a lot of what we call good education has always been global. Think about music education, think about world history, geography, literature, in many places, has a cosmopolitan bent to it. Citizenship education, as you know, those of you who are regulars in this seminar, cultivates the disposition and the capability to engage, but not necessarily understanding or acting upon relationships between global and local. So let me give you an example. What would this look like in a university? Many universities develop citizenship education programs through their service learning activities. And so it is in that way that they will cultivate these dispositions, this desire, this responsibility to act. But you can do that in ways that are absolutely parochial. So an example of this would be the Paul University has had for a very long time a freshman seminar called Getting to Know Chicago. It was initially about helping students develop a sense of place and time in the city, and they connected that with the service learning. About 20 years ago, they realized that Chicago, you couldn't understand Chicago if you didn't understand global influences in Chicago. And so this seminar became, by design, a global citizenship course, a course that was about helping the different communities that settled in Chicago in different places, helping students understand Chicago in a larger context, and helping them understand things like refugees, for example, as they develop those dispositions of students to life. I think that there are many ways in which, so back to your earlier question, a global education, yes, global education, not citizenship, is about helping students get out of their parochialism that much education can have. But that doesn't necessarily mean global citizenship. It means that you understand, you develop a certain competency, you understand these local global connections. A global citizenship education helps you not only understand those connections, but also cultivate the desire to act. And then I think that education can take very many different forms. I don't think that you require a course. Some people know that with Connie and Bidor and Nell and Julia Pignon, one of our graduates, we developed this global studies curriculum, which you can all download for free online for empowering global citizens. And that's one way to do global citizenship education. You could imagine a global citizenship education that would be expressed in a menu of options for students to help understand those global local connections and to cultivate that capability to act and that desire, that intentionality to act. So I think it's part and parcel. I imagine you're familiar with the distinctions between civic education and citizenship education, those of you who come to this seminar. And so I think global citizenship is squarely situated within the field of citizenship education, not just civic education as traditionally understood, but it does have this global connection to it. And I should distinguish global citizenship also from a strand of ideas that are about how do you align education in math, in science, or in language to world standards. And these are strand of ideas that have gotten a lot of currency since we had these comparative assessments of student knowledge and skills as of the year 2000, where people say, well, learning science shouldn't be any different in Shanghai and in Boston. There should be a canon of what science is, and students should be educated, held to the same standards. And some people, when they talk about global education for the 21st century skills, that's what they mean. And that's not what I mean when I talk about global citizenship education. I think global citizenship, of course, presumes that people understand science and mathematics and language, but that alone doesn't get you to understand the connection between your local community, the global, and doesn't necessarily commit you to act on issues of global significance.
Thank you very much, Fernando. Sarah, how about you next?
Sure. So in terms of like Connie providing some context for my entree into this work, I feel like I've been very shaped by working with refugee communities and the experiences of refugee young people and how to think about global citizenship. So I wanted to start by sharing a story and then pose some questions about global citizenship that I think get at some of these paradoxes that we're asking about the concept in general. Annette was a refugee student who I met in 2002 when I worked in Uganda. She had fled Democratic Republic of Congo and was living in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. And the camp that she lived in at that time was filled with ongoing fighting, continued ethnic conflicts in the camp, a shortage of food. But she went to school every day because she really believed that education was going to be her hope for the future in a place where she couldn't imagine where that future would really be. But then one day her dad planted bananas around their compound. And that was her signal that the future was going to be in Uganda, that bananas mature over a long period of time. So if you're only going to be in a place for a short period of time, you just simply don't plant them. So then she had to shift her sense of what the future might be and plant it there in Uganda. She was in Uganda going to school under the auspices of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, so a global agency that provided the funding for her to go to school within a Ugandan national school. She followed the Ugandan curriculum. She learned in English, which was the language of instruction in Uganda. And at the end of primary school, she would sit for the national exam and get the Ugandan primary school leaving certificate. Every day she stood in the middle of her compound in front of the Ugandan flag and sang the national anthem, including the words, "O Uganda, we lay our future in thy hand." And slowly she began to realize that while she was treated as part of the nation state in some ways, that she would never be part of the nation state. That no matter how many years she went to school, she would never be able to work in Uganda, so she would never be able to practice as a nurse, which was what she hoped that education would lead her to. And thinking about this example of Annette brings me to some of the real questions I have about global citizenship education. I see refugees, not just Annette, but globally caught between this global promise of the universal right to education, but then also the definition of citizenship rights within states, and then the realization of the tension between this right of accessing education and the lack of rights to act on that education within the context of any given country. So on the one hand, I think we could think of the kind of cross-border living that refugees do as really providing opportunities for global citizenship, exposure to global identities, to a kind of cosmopolitanism, and the development of the kinds of knowledge and skills that allow them to be flexible and put their knowledge to use in multiple different contexts. And in divided societies, conflicted societies, we know that the concept of national identity is innately problematic and contested. And Lynn Davies, who is an established scholar within the conflict field, really argues that a globally oriented citizenship holds promise for overcoming some of these differences. But I really take issue with this claim because what we see in some empirical studies and in the work that Vidur and I and others have been doing in refugee communities is that marginalized and disenfranchised young people in Northern Ireland and Israel, conflicted within their own countries, or refugees across national borders, find that this kind of access to a global citizenship in idea and in practice is not really viable given the kinds of socio-political and legal restrictions that they face. So if we think back to the situation of Annette, we also see that it's not unique to Uganda. And I know, I'm sure Vidur will talk more about Syrian refugees in Lebanon as well, and thinking about the way in which they are not part of Lebanon, have no prospect of returning to Syria, and yet the world more broadly is not open to them, just as it was not open to Annette. So, and I guess I mean the world more broadly open to them is that they don't have the right to be free from bullying. They don't have the right to be free from discrimination within their society in which they live. They don't have the right to work. They don't have the right to move within that space. So that their worlds are physically and cognitively constrained in ways that are really in tension with the kinds of exciting possibilities, Fernando, that you pointed to in terms of the curiosity and developing empathy and understanding that global citizen is really all about. So I think refugees really find themselves stuck in the middle of these three realities of a country of origin, a country of exile, and a broader world, which seem to create opportunities for global citizenship, but which in the concrete experiences of their marginalized daily lives really limit those opportunities. So I guess just in conclusion, I think that if we think about global citizenship as a kind of must-have, as Connie is describing, then we need to think a lot more about what happens outside of schools and the kind of conditions for participation and a sense of belonging within society broadly that would be the basis for any kind of citizenship, education, global or otherwise. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. Vidur.
Thanks. It's great to see so many familiar faces here. I am sort of like the student voice, and just in sort of full disclosure, I work closely both with Fernando and Sarah and with Connie on this book project that Fernando was speaking about. I don't think we lie on different sides of the debate, really. I think we have variations in our understanding of how we conceptualize it, and these variations stem from the communities we work in and work with. And I think that is what we bring to this conversation today. So, as you think about, like, as I was thinking about, why am I here? Like, why me as a part of this panel? Because I don't research global citizenship formally as such, but as I think about my own personal life trajectory, I think in some ways it represents this idea of boundary crossing and a straddling between the local and the global. So I am Indian, and that's what India was where I completed my undergraduate studies. I moved to the US for graduate studies. But I've also, increasingly, my research is more of a global nature. So I work in contexts that I'm not a citizen of. So I work in East Africa, in the Middle East. And these have all been contexts that are new and alien to me. And so I've had to bring my multiple identities and affiliations. And depending on which context I am in and who I'm speaking with, I will draw on different identities of mine at that point in time. But as I think about the people that I work with, some of whom will represent the most marginalized young people today, and that is refugee youth, I have a few questions that I decided to pose to the panel at large, and these are not necessarily because I don't think we see global citizenship differently. We all see it as a framework, as a way that guides our thinking about knowing and being and doing in the world, and really trying to understand how do I relate to other people in the world at large who might or might not be like me. And how do I find my sense of place and space within this planet, right? But there are two or three things that I wanted to speak about. One of which is, as Sarah was talking about, refugee youth and young people broadly, or even immigrant youth who kind of occupy these transnational spaces. So is local citizenship an antecedent to sort of global citizenship, and do you need strong local identifications to be able to engender this idea of global citizenship broadly? And if that is true, then what does that mean for people who occupy this third space, who are transnational, who are here and there, as well as young people who are stateless? So if you think of young Palestinians today who've been displaced, who've had generations of displacement, there is this idea of return to an imagined land. but is that really going to happen, and what that is going to look like in the future, we don't know. And so how do you form that sort of affiliation, knowing that there isn't any strong, necessarily local identification, or where your local identification is your camp or your small sort of community or the urban slum in which you live in Beirut because you're Palestinian and so you don't have the rights to work or to be able to sort of continue your education. And so this idea of the disposition to act that Fernando was speaking about is, what do you act on in that context? Do you act on a larger sort of issue of movement and forced migration? You act on an issue that is local to you but gets severely constrained by the rights that the nation, that your host country, not even your own nation state, but your host country imposes on you. So I think that is one. The second was just this idea of equity and of thinking of who gets it and who doesn't. And so Helen, to your question where you said, is this sort of avoiding parochial thinking among Western students, I disagree with that. I think as an Indian student who's a product of a private education system, I can't recollect when in my education, my school education, there was some framing of larger sort of global issues or the capacity to be able to engage or act on global issues. I think that for me that happened outside of school. And thinking of what the spaces outside of school that we bring into that shape our understandings. But I think there is an issue of equity that exists. So if you look at the kids in Cameroon, or if you look at the Syrian refugee youth in Lebanon, or if you look at young people here and who has access to the skills and the tools to be able to develop global citizenship, and what does that mean for education systems? And then finally, it's just this idea of is the global citizen a good local citizen? So there might be something that is happening at a local level that you fundamentally disagree with, and you go out and you protest, and the protest might turn violent, for example. And so your nation state would immediately reject or discard you as being a bad citizen because you are disrupting the national order of civility within a society. But if I'm protesting around a larger global issue of, say, of refugee movements or forced migration, something that I fundamentally care about and that I'm passionate about, somebody else might call me a good global citizen because I'm working on an issue that has global significance, but yet I'm acting on it in a way that disrupts local civility. And so what is the tension there between global citizenship and local citizenship and what that means? So.
Well, thank you, Vito, for this very useful comments. Okay, so who wants to pick up on various points people have made? Are you really all agreeing with each other? I have a feeling, actually, that, and I felt all along with thinking about this topic, is, does it really mean the same thing? You've picked up, the four of you, what seem to be implicitly different people. You've talked about people who are marginal and very much deprived of power, and at a transition or even permanently, if it were, marginalised and outside the mainstream. And people for whom even the concept of rights is often really an alien concept because it isn't available to them. And to some extent, you're talking about people who are already quite privileged, who are living in a country which, to a large extent, does provide the, as you say, the inequitable benefits of being able to engage with different levels of local and global awareness because there is less deprivation. So, I mean, does it feel different to be somebody, a child in one of your refugee camps, in terms of what's possible for them and what would be desirable for them, from the kind of person in Chicago who could benefit from hearing a global picture rather than just a local picture?
I think it is true that even students at DePaul in Chicago are probably quite privileged by world standards, but you should know that DePaul University is a university established by the order of Vincenzo Trees, committed to first-generation students. Most of those students are the first-generation families to get their own financial aid. So by Harvard standards, those students are not privileged at all. But I think relative to a person in a refugee camp, of course, it would be quite privileged. So I don't know what you mean by does it feel different. What I do think our various presentations have in common is that talking about global citizenship education and global education is certainly raising the bar of what is education worth having. And that creates tremendous complications for most settings, not only for refugee camps, I think to some extent Sarah was alluding to that, but for public schools in the United States. If this is going to be the bar that we hold educators accountable to, where are the people ready to provide that education? So I agree that this creates a puzzle. How are we going to do that? And there is a risk that this is only going to increase inequities, that as we adopt to some extent, this is happening already. As I look at efforts in the United States, I mean, the organization that we developed this curriculum for is a private independent school where students pay $45,000 a year to attend. And as we think about how do we get schools where students don't pay that, it is challenging. They don't have the same affordances for sure. So the issue of equities is a real issue. Does it feel different? Not necessarily right. I mean, there's a way in which you could imagine a global education that is about reinforcing a lot of white privilege and developing a lot of savior complex. And that's not what I mean about global citizenship education at all. I mean, global citizenship education, in my mind, is aligned to compacts like human rights. And that means that it is a relational concept back to your refugee or your immigrant, for example. Think about Somali refugees in Minnesota. And imagine a kid that goes to school, and on the way to school, she sees 5 graffiti that says Muslims go home, right? And so yes, of course, you have to think about what happens outside the school. But an education that does not address that issue and gives both that student and her peers, those writing graffiti, an understanding of the fundamental equality that they have and develop a disposition to a shared commitment to creating a society that is inclusive, is failing all of them, not only the refugee, but her non-refugee peers. So when I think about global citizenship education, the notion of equality and commitment to human rights is part and parcel of that. And that equality is a relational concept. So we've all talked about global citizenship from the point of view of disempowered youth. I think about that. But I'm thinking about it from the point of view of classrooms and schools. I think equality advances not only when subdominant groups get the opportunity to develop new skills, but when dominant groups develop new understandings about this relationship that allows them to benefit from equality and causes them to embrace different possibilities of relationship. And so, take immigrants, which is not the same as refugees, for example. We know, we have evidence, have had it for 15 years, because someone had the right idea to include in the team study a few questions as to what kind of violence do you experience in school. And the team study also asked, are you an immigrant? And so we know that there are extraordinary levels of violence around the world and in this country that immigrant students are subject to. A global citizenship education would create a context that would address that kind of issue, would connect the education with what's happening in the world to the extent that it is trying to develop these positions to improve the world and to bring it into alignment with notions of fairness, justice, human rights. Anyway, I've talked too much.
I think I want to kind of make a couple of things that I'm thinking about, just share them with you and have respond. One of the things I realize is, globalization, while the concept of global citizenship education might be new, globalization, again, as I kind of thought about this more and more, has been around for centuries. We think about the Silk Road in China, or other ways in which people had explored, dominated, subjugated, however, whatever verb you want to put in, different parts of the world and have interacted with each other in favorable and less favorable ways. It's just been around for a long time. I don't know that we teach history in that way, for example, but I think a reframing of the way that we teach history so that that reality is made more present, and the ways in which we discuss the impact that we have on each other is really, really important. Again, as the rapid rise of technology and as things shrink, migration, and it feels like it's been around for a while, but the fact that we haven't talked about it for a while is kind of damaging what we're doing, the state of the world. If you think about the Brexit vote, forgetting the norms and the values that are embedded in that, but just the fact that many people who voted to leave just did not have the basic knowledge around how intertwined our institutions are economically, politically, socially, in other ways, and the impact, the rippling impact that decision has had not just in the UK, but Europe as a whole, I don't know that we equip the people who are voting for that decision with the proper knowledge in our schools to make to make an informed decision, regardless of whether you think that was right or wrong. From the articles that I've been reading post that vote, it felt like people were making decisions on partial knowledge, not around this notion of it's complicated or already really well integrated. It's really hard to pull that apart. So those are a couple of points that I make as far as just at the basic knowledge level, the need to kind of have a knowledge about global affairs in institutions.
I have to agree about Brexit, of course. I was there in my country. Yes. Yeah. And I think you were right. Because in fact, of course.
Well, of course, a lot of people can vote no.
I did vote, yes. And like everybody else, and this is actually not, it's quite relevant to keep it picking up. What was interesting about the morning after, well, first of all, the result was very, very fast. I mean, I woke up that morning thinking, well, sometime this afternoon we might know. By 7:15 in the morning, like, barely 8 hours after the polls closed, the result was in. But we were, people who inhabit my social and intellectual world were horrified and surprised. So the surprise was that the two things, you were quite right, that many people who voted to leave were clearly uninformed about the economic consequences. But also, generally, the people who were responsible for thinking about the issues more broadly were uninformed about what most people in the country thought. And to some extent, they say echoes of that with Trump. It's surprising that people actually believe those things. Why don't we, who are supposed to be the elite, know about them? But so I think the point about local and global knowledge and where we actually have access to what that local knowledge really is and where the gaps are, not only what the gaps are, but also what people believe, which might be a counter-narrative to the one that we'd like them to believe. I think that's an important part of the kind of question I was really asking. What about you two coming up with this thinking about the initial question?
Yeah, I guess I wanted to ask more, and maybe when we open this up too, for ideas of how we think about this way of combining the local and the global as we think about these power dynamics. So of thinking about a global citizenship education that prepares students to act in any situation where they see that inequity, and having both the opportunity to act and the responsibility to act. So in many ways, I think it's much easier to teach the responsibility to act, but in the absence of opportunity to act, then we run into these situations of thinking about, well, what does inclusion look like or not look like? And so when we're looking at, again, any marginalized community, not just refugees, but we can think about this country as well, we can think about Cambridge, of how do we work with students to adopt a kind of mindset that is inherently optimistic and curious and forward-looking and action-oriented in the absence of being able to take any concrete, productive action. And sometimes that's as a result of legal restrictions, and sometimes that's a result of the kind of marginalization and discrimination that we're talking about. And then I agree, Fernando, that the role of our classrooms can be to build that kind of understanding where we allow people on all different points of marginalization to see from each other's point of view and to understand those dynamics. But I also see in the refugee youth and young people that Vidura and I have worked with, you get to the end of an education like that, and then you're faced with a situation where you simply cannot get a job. You simply cannot take action on an issue that you think is morally outrageous. You simply cannot speak up or you'll be imprisoned. Then you just run into this kind of tension that seems irreconcilable to me. And how do we think about transforming society in ways that can reflect the kind of good practice that you're describing in classrooms? Not that that's an easy question. You have an answer.
So just obviously more questions, but I think just in response to your point where you said, who's going to provide this, and I think teachers are a critical ingredient in this and in thinking about this work. I do think about contexts where teachers are not on board or have not bought into this idea of embracing the global. Because the local itself is, I think even this idea of like what is local, right? There isn't like homogeneity there, and everybody has a different understanding of what constitutes like just locality in broadly, right? But I mean, Jordan recently tried to sort of secularize its curriculum a little bit more, and there were riots on the streets. You know, the copies of the textbooks that were burned. We see this in India happening all the time as well, and so this is it's a very local issue, trying to make it a little more secular and more inclusive at a local level, but it obviously has larger sort of like global ramifications. It reflects larger, you know, global principles of equality and inclusion. But even if at the local level with an issue like that, there is so much of outrage, then I don't know, and I don't mean to sound like pessimistic about it, but I'm just being the realist in the room of thinking about, you know, how will that happen. But I also do think that there is like traditionally our existing like conventional models of education have failed millions of kids, including some of the most marginalized. And I do think that that there might be a way to be able to flip the model around on its head and to think about global citizenship as a starting point, to be able to embrace some sort of universal humanity as compared to I am this and I am not that. But saying we are together, this is who we are.
I'm not so sure that pessimism is a bad thing. I think to some extent we can be overly optimistic because we have a very clear set of values and goals and fundamental beliefs and assumptions which we bring to our work, of course, because we're educators. But I think that a little pessimism is quite useful. The data tends to suggest that people can become actively involved in all kinds of contexts. Firstly, feel anger, they feel a moral outrage. And secondly, are quite pessimistic. They're actually pessimistic about the future, they're pessimistic about social institutions, they're pessimistic about power relations. And that kind of pessimism, as long as it's combined with a sense of efficacy and agency, actually is what inspires activism, not really optimism, which can be quite bland. So I wouldn't underestimate the importance of pessimism in looking at civic and citizenship activism worldwide. So, shall we open to the group now, because we have a lot of people in the audience, I'm sure, have things to say. You over here, yes, that's it.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I am from Morocco, which is becoming increasingly a land of intermediate migration. It's a transit country now, and I worked very briefly with UNHCR as interpreter for refugees coming from sub-Saharan French-speaking countries. And I saw the reactions of UNHCR officers who just had to get information about people's stories and be very intransigent and like try to focus on the knowledge, on the content, rather than feel things. And obviously I was heartbroken because I wasn't trained to be a UNHCR officer. I'm linking this to the role of teachers. Teachers seem increasingly to be playing roles of these UNHCR officers. I feel they have this bunch of students who coming from different backgrounds and who have been through a lot of really heartbreaking situations, and oftentimes there's little room for care because, in my opinion, we care a lot about learning. We care a lot about the knowledge of global citizenship and the things that we need to learn about it, as opposed to the things that we need to feel and be able to communicate as caring on a daily basis. So I guess my question is, like, how do you envision the ways in which teachers should adapt their roles and their self-perception and their understanding of what global citizenship is and what caring means to really attend to these students and pretty much everybody's needs when you think about it?
Who else wants that? Fernando, yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure I see the division between the knowledge and the emotions in the same way that you do. I think that one of the things that a good humanities education has always done is allow people the capacity to feel the way others do. I mean, isn't that what you do when you study literature or art, something like that? I agree with you that this shouldn't just be about knowing facts about the world, but being able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes But I think there are different pathways to get there. As you were speaking, you reminded me of J.K. Rowling. I don't know if you've had a chance to hear her commencement speech here at Harvard, where she talked about her work in Amnesty International, doing similar things. And she credits that experience with the development of her imagination, which really means empathy. She says, it was that work of interviewing these people who had suffered horrific political persecution that helped me feel what it was like to be that person, put myself in those shoes. Anyway, so I guess I agree and disagree with you all at the same time.
I was just going to say, I think two things. The first is that I think teachers can be this example for students who are new to a context or don't feel like they belong of a possible transforming relationship. And so really can be the linchpin, actually both for students and families, in that new, building a new life. I'm thinking of work that I did with African refugees in Massachusetts and two different schools. One that was the kind of metaphor that makes sense. Literally, you walked into the principal's office and an entire wall was covered with every student's name and their score on every test that they had ever taken in that school year. And the principal never left her office. Like, that chart was the reality of what she needed to do as an instructional leader. Contrasted to another school, also serving large numbers of African refugees, where the principal was never in her office. The principal knew every single child's name. They came up at the end of the school year for just a certificate. They came up in random orders. Like, she greeted every single kid by their first and last name, pronounced appropriately. And it was an entirely different experience. Both those schools had the same scores on the Massachusetts state. They were ranked the same on the report cards. But they were entirely different experiences, and those kids were doing very differently in those different schools. And I think it makes a huge difference.
I think we have a queue now. Natasha's next, I think.
Thanks, this is really interesting. So I wanted to ask all of you, it seems like part of this global citizenship education is cultivating a global identity, I think that maybe many of you are suggesting. And I guess I wanted to question, like, is a global identity really a durable identity? And I'm going to offer an alternative. I think we tend to sort of see national identity as often from looking at it from a very kind of ethnocentric, national identity is to blame for the rise of Trump, for Brexit, etc. But I wonder if we can cultivate, in terms of looking at this question of global connectedness and global inequality, a national identity that is much more inclusive. So I'll just give you an example of this. So I was looking with a colleague at how young people think about national identity in the United States context. And what we found was that the children of immigrants were much more likely to see these boundaries of like race and class on the one hand. On the other hand, many of them said, well, some people think that American means to be white and live in the suburbs, but American is actually a multicultural identity. And I was, sometimes they would say things like, I was born here, I speak English, and so I'm American too. Or, my parents, don't have legal status, but they contribute to the economy, so they're American too. So they would draw on these much more inclusive understandings of what it means to be American that are kind of globally linked. And in the way that I think a lot of elites do this, right? Think of themselves as cosmopolitans and, I think, the college students that we talked to were much more likely to talk about Americanness as a kind of multicultural identity, right? And so, anyway, a lot of thoughts jumbled together. I'm just wondering how you think about, would we have more success in cultivating national identities that are more inclusive than in promoting a global identity, which is really hard to kind of get your finger on the ground at the local level.
That's a very important point.
I think, again, if you think about schooling as a kind of a national project, right, talking about public schools, and again, thinking about education industries in different countries and agendas to ensure stability and everything else is there for their nation state. That tension between the national identity and other identities is something that is dynamic and, as you said, is probably not helpful to say this is it, but that moving dynamic identity, and as Pedro mentioned, I have multiple identities, not just one. So kind of increasing, I think I would want to see more kind of dialogue and discussion around the tensions around what that means. So, specifically thinking, again, as an American, yes, like we have this pride in being Americans and whatever that, with all the positive, but there's also a huge bucket of negatives as well. So even within the national identity, the tension of what are the positive things about what we've done as a country, and what are some of the negative things, and how do you teach that in, again, how do you teach that to students in a way that they both embrace the positivity, but also have a constructive way to criticize and, again, kind of construct something else that might be a slightly better version of what we have right now in their communities and in their countries. So that's a quick answer.
I was just going to say, I wonder if it also would be usefully informed by a better understanding of the relationship between the national identity and the global. So I'm thinking about this in terms of work that I'm doing in Botswana, a country of just a few million people, that it's impossible to separate what a Botswana identity would be from a global identity, because it's so caught up in this, like, we're a tiny country in this huge continent and in this huge world. But on the other hand, there are certain elements of global identity that are relevant and certain elements of global identity that are not. And I think for refugees, we see this real tension, because if you can't situate your national identity as something that has any relevance to a global agenda, your country's not recognized, you don't have right to move across borders, and so can't be global in that way, of whether, again, that shapes how we might think about global identity. And I wonder, too, whether it comes back to your question, too. I think this is mostly to agree with you, Natasha, that to think about these dynamics, but of whether it seems easier or less problematic in the US because we could link a national and a global identity in ways that may or may not be correct.
Thank you. Can I speak to this issue?
Yes, yes.
Just very quickly. So many people see these two in opposition, national identity with global. And to some extent, there is no global jurisdiction in the way in which there is a nation state. There is no global passport in which you have a national passport. I don't see these two in opposition. I think that just like I can be an American, and a Hispanic, and a man, and a Catholic, and these oppositions are like, these identities are not in opposition to one another. They make me who I am, I'm a father, and so on. I can also be very interested in human rights and care deeply about what happens to children in Pakistan. And that doesn't take away anything of my love and commitment for this country. I do think I don't see opposition between a global identity and patriotism, but I do see an opposition between a global identity and chauvinism. I think it's a lot harder to be chauvinistic when you develop a certain cosmopolitanism, because you can put things in perspective. So when I hear all these current discourse and all this vitriol about Hispanic immigrants and Mexicans and so on, because I identify with this community, because I know the history of how this country appropriated a huge piece of land of Mexico, I hear it in a very different way than people who may be ignorant of the history of this country. And it allows me, on the one hand, to be more forgiving, and on the other hand, to be more outraged by the ignorance that underlies a lot of the racism that we see in our discourse. And in that sense, I do think that if we just educated people better, if we made sure they could think, if we made sure they knew the facts, if we made sure they had the feelings, they'll be less likely to be victims of leaders who would play exactly on that kind of ignorance. So, but I see the point, and a lot of people see those two in opposition. I'm in full agreement that it's very important as societies become increasingly diverse, that they work to help students develop a complex sense of what it means to be a citizen of the place. But we should keep in mind that there are plenty of children in this country and elsewhere who don't meet the test of what it means to be a citizen for a range of reasons. In these countries, it becomes harder and harder to become a citizen than it used to be 100 years ago. And there are people who are in a long limbo, and even those who are not in long limbo have to wait a long period until they can become citizens, even when they are going through the process. I'm talking about immigrant kids. And I think that given that reality, the fact that these two identities, global and local, can be mutually, can help each other, is a good thing, because a child may not yet be a U.S. citizen. Doesn't mean they are not a person, and they're not a person that has a whole range of other very affirming identities, and they are a citizen of the world.
A lot depends on the context. In some contexts there is a tension because the local context does make it very difficult to bridge the two. In other contexts it doesn't.
Sure,
You.
Thank you to the panel. I feel like one thing I learned the most from the panel is how when we think about global citizen education, we think about globalization, which has in history been very much tied with colonial developments. So I wonder, like, when we think about the relationship between global and the local, what if the contradiction doesn't just come from the opposition that I agree, which is not necessarily between your global identity versus your local identity, but what if the contradiction comes from like how this kind of to what extent? Sorry, let me reframe. Like, when we think about global citizenship education, have we thought to what extent we haven't really been able to integrate other ways of imagining citizenship from the globe? And also, when we think about human rights and universal humanism, to what extent we have actually developed this context, this concept exclusively from a Western mode of thought. So I wonder, like, this kind of conflict between the global and the local, how we approach global citizenship education.
Can I, before I the answers, I mean, you come from China.
Oh, yeah.
Therefore, you're coming already having a perspective which isn't, you didn't grow up with an American perspective. So, I mean, when you say it's a Western perspective, where are you coming from? Are you being critical in this? Are you saying there are things that you know about that we don't? You're brave enough to say this.
I should do the same thing as you guys do. Yes. So I grew up in China and come from Chinese background. So when we think about citizenship, I think that tension is even more like prevalent for me. Thinking about kind of like we emphasize more on, like, for example, relationships on like family levels, and we, in that sense, like, build our citizenship more grounded in familial relationships, and that's even harder to think beyond that to a global level. And when we talk about human rights in China, that's like a very controversial concept. Human rights in China won't necessarily mean something that's like Western, and that goes tight with the Western colonial history in China. So the discourse about human rights is more framed as a critique, like against Chinese government, like holding the authority over the people. But at the same time, like, to what extent that might be actually true, like through history. So yeah, I'm just very struggling with the idea of universalism, basically, but that's actually a foundation for global citizenship.
Would you feel differently about human rights if you, for example, listen to Jimmy Carter, who says that the United States is one of the worst offenders of human rights? And in that context, would you be more open to entertaining the possibility that human rights might be a problem? Or you would still think this is a very foreign alien concept?
That's the interesting thing, like, when you go out of your country and see how this concept is being critiqued at the local level in the West. But that's different still when you are back in China, hearing about the discourse of human rights. And I think this is more institutional, systematic level, not just because American is also failing apart in terms of human rights, that can make this concept then more globally applicable. I'm not sure if that's clear, but
I think we'll take time. You had a question, didn't you?
Yes.
I think you have your question, then we can have an answer from the panel. Yes.
Okay. So
Thank you. It's very helpful. Yes.
So before coming here, I focused on conflict resolution research, but it was like ensconced in like organizational management studies. So it became handy when people were having conflict in the workplace.
I'm having a hard time hearing you.
Sorry, my voice is low. So conflict resolution, though practical to practitioners, obviously, and people who are learning it, and you think about how you can help people facilitate conversations easier or just talk to one another and actually hear each other's perspectives, that makes sense to people who study it, but for the most part, people don't really care about it unless they come to blows within an organization and a specialist or a consultant is brought in to like diagnose the issue and solve it between them. So I'm trying to understand like practical ways of, I know there are like workshops, there's adding to the literature, there's stuff like that, but I want to understand like practical ways or ideas for practical ways of educating people even retroactively if they don't get this done when they're young enough to like, you know, be born in the age of ideas where this is a thing when they're in kindergarten, but like how to do that, yeah, retroactively in a way. How would I do that for a high schooler, or how would I do that for people who are going to a college campus?
Peter wants to answer this.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and my response may come across as overly simplistic, but I think I think of pop culture a lot, right, and the commodification of pop culture, and as I think about the young people that I've worked with in a refugee camp in Burundi, who, refugees who come from the DRC, you ask them about any sort of popular artist here in the US, you can have a conversation about, Celine Dion, or you can have a conversation about Kanye West, right? They all know it. They all know it, right? Now, if you ask a kid here, how many of you know of, say, of Strome, who's like a Rwandan Belgian singer, who talks about, his oppression as a factor of colonialism, and I think there is value there in being able to appreciate and understand, and music as a starting point, just as one sort of universal element that we all appreciate, that we all understand, we all hear, but at least like how many of us even understand like the origin of a song or music, or what that means, or how is language created, and this is your world. But really thinking about even something as tiny as that, and being more active in being able to listen and being able to engage with issues that are local, that are happening far away from us, but yet have sort of larger global influence. And so this is like something really tiny, and it's like simplistic, but yet one example of how are young people understanding and shaping the world today.
I think it's a very nice example of the way that at the sort of micro local levels, in a sense, the things that young people are really interested in at the personal local level actually can be taken to the larger context, right? Between the local and the global.
And as you think of social media as well. And
that's right, yes. Social media. I think we've got time for one last quick question. Yes?
So thank you. This has been sort of tremendously illuminating. I want to just hone in on this idea of having teachers and schools be the setting to really explore and develop global citizenship education per se. And the idea, I think, anybody who's sort of been in a school there aren't ample reserves of time just waiting to be used. And so to me, it seems like a minute spent on global citizenship education development per se is a minute that isn't spent doing something else. And I'd just like sort of your opinion on what that something else should be that gives way.
That's a nice question. A quick answer from all four of you.
I have a quick answer.
Very quick.
There is a young man, he's 33, he's young anyway, Craig Kielberger. He created a movement called WE. It really is a global movement for civic engagement, a strong piece of which is global. And he signed up thousands of schools around the world as his movement. What he's saying is, I'm not asking that you teach a new subject. I'm just asking that you connect what you teach with some kind of service, local and global. Look them up, because I think it's a good example of how you break out of the zero-sum mentality that says, if we do this, it's at the expense of something else. Now, what I think is a secret to what he's created is, A, he has really built a movement that includes a lot of celebrities, and he has these big happenings in places where young people come in, and there is music, and he shows that there's a way in which you can get people to use differently the time that they use it to learn mathematics and science and so on. Look them up.
Connie?
I think, again,